Hi everyone, my name is Nathan. I am going to be doing my policy presentation this week on the policy regulations that govern Uber and taxis, and I'm specifically going to focus on a case from Toronto. So just to start off with, I am giving this presentation in Victoria, BC, which is the traditional territories of the WSÁNEĆ, Esquimalt, and Songhees Nation. So I'm going to start off a little bit differently. So again, I'm going to be focusing on regulations that govern Uber and taxi drivers. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit of a story, and then we will get into kind of like the meat of my presentation. So on the early morning of March 21st, 2018, Nick Cameron, a young Toronto-raised man, and his girlfriend Monica were headed to the airport together for their first vacation as a couple to Mexico. Nick pulled his phone out and arranged an Uber to pick them up. At around 3 a.m., the Uber driver arrived. Getting into the car, the pair were excitedly talking about their upcoming trip. The driver punched in the directions into his phone and placed it in the dashboard in his phone holder. The driver began going the wrong way, going east, which was away from the airport. Nick and Monica, both Toronto-born and raised, urged the driver to take the Garnier Expressway, which is a highway in Toronto. The driver suggested taking city streets rather than the highway, but eventually complied with the pair's request. While approaching the Garnier Expressway, the driver's phone fell off his dashboard holder. Because he was using the phone to navigate, the driver pulled over onto the narrow shoulder near Royal York Road. It's been stated by many people that this shoulder is barely a car width, and people do not typically pull over here. Upon retrieving his phone, the driver merged back into traffic without checking his mirrors. At this time, a BMW came charging down the road from behind and smashed into the left side of the slow-moving Uber where Nick was sitting. Nick was taken to hospital without vital signs, with a broken neck and massive brain damage. He remained on life support for 36 hours but passed away among his friends and family. The driver survived with little more than a broken hand, and Monica sustained minor injuries. So this is a heartbreaking story of a tragic accident that took place earlier this year in Toronto. However, many people see this as more than a fatal accident, but as a policy failure on the part of the City of Toronto's regulations regarding Uber drivers. So just so everyone kind of knows, before I launch into my presentation, Uber is a rideshare program. It was created by a man named Travis Kalanick. It was created 7 years ago while Travis and his friend were waiting for a cab in Paris in the snow. They were waiting for a really long time, and through waiting, they kind of came up with the idea of a rideshare program using your smartphone. So Uber first launched in San Francisco and has spread like wildfire since then to over 58 countries globally and is valued at over $6 billion. There are also other rideshare apps like Uber that allow you to hitch a ride with an amateur driver, such as Lyft. So before I go into the policy responses regarding the death of Nick Cameron, I'm going to give an overview of the policy, the state of policy while, before the accident happened. So currently in Toronto, Uber is not regulated. This is not the case with other cities, such as Montreal, Chicago, and most recently New York. So Uber says it relies on its own internal rating system to regulate the drivers by allowing customers to rate and post their experiences with the drivers to the app. Uber and Uber supporters argue that this system works to keep bad drivers out and rewards good drivers. So the idea here is that people will give 5-star ratings to good drivers, and those drivers will get more rides and be rewarded, and drivers who continually are getting low rating system will be weeded out. So in 2016, in a city council meeting set to decide how to legalize rideshare programs through insurance, with mounting pressure from cab companies worried that Uber would wipe them out, the City of Toronto decided to forego regulations for Uber and cab drivers' licensing requirements in what the city called an effort to give cab drivers the ability to compete with companies like Uber. So currently, and at the time of the accident, in order to become an Uber driver in Toronto, all you needed was a regular driver's license, proof of insurance, a clean driving abstract for the last 3 years. You have to do a yearly admission check, have fewer than 9 demerit points, have no overdue laws or law fines, and no major criminal convictions or road infractions. So currently, it's the same with cab drivers in Toronto. But before this city council meeting, cab drivers had to have a vehicle that was less than 6 years old. You had to undergo a 17-day safety training course, have their car inspected by the city twice a year, have a criminal record check, and you needed a specialized commercial insurance um, and licensing, which was regulated through the City of Toronto and was paid for by the individual cab driver. So that said, before the city council meeting to regulate rideshare programs, it was much more difficult to obtain a cab license. But in an effort to help cab companies, the city of Toronto said that they were going to make rideshare programs legal, but then deregulate taxis as well, so that they could compete with Uber. So in other places, though, like Montreal, Chicago, and New York, like I said, not only Uber, but all rideshare companies like Lyft are required to undergo similar safety regulations to cab companies, such as in-class safety lessons, written exams, and road tests. So more specifically, in Quebec, drivers have to undergo 35 hours of training. In Alberta, drivers have to get a special Class 4 driver's license. They have to do a written test, they have a medical test, and they do a road test. In New York, they have the TLC license, which is the same as taxi drivers. They have to do a defensive driving course and a written exam. In Chicago, they have to get a TNP permit, same as taxi drivers, have to do an approximately 2-week safety course. And in Seattle, drivers have to do an online defensive course. So it seems that, again, each city is deciding how to tackle this issue individually and through different policies. Cities are still trying to decide how to deal with the issue of regulating companies like Uber. Okay, so as I've just said, lots of cities have come up with different ways of regulating rideshare programs. The city of Toronto decided to not regulate. So now I'm going to go over the policy responses. After Nick's death. So how the city defended itself and why they decided to not regulate. And I'm going to talk about people who support regulating and why perhaps that's at fault here in Nick's death. So in Nick's case, and others who support regulating companies like Uber argue that it would be in the public's best interest to further prevent accidents like this one. Some of Nick's friends have come forward to the City of Toronto's Licensing and Standards Committee requesting regulation for Uber drivers. Nick's 2 siblings have also started an online petition to demand that the Toronto City Council put in place safety training for rideshare companies and taxi drivers. So some of the arguments put forward by Nick's family and friends are a demand for more safety regulations, which they argue could have prevented Nick's death. So some of the regulations they propose include a road test, learning local geography and roadways, especially for newcomers or immigrants. So the driver that killed Nick was a 23-year-old from Ottawa who had recently moved to Toronto. He'd literally only been a driver in Toronto for 5 days. So Nick's friends argue that standardized safety testing would have illustrated the danger of pulling over onto the highway shoulder and would have demonstrated that this wasn't safe, and also having an understanding of local geography would have perhaps led him not to go the wrong direction in the first place. So people in support of more regulations argue that the people who lose out here are the customers. Getting into a car with drivers who haven't been safety vetted or through any kind of training puts customers at risk. And in the example of Nick's death, we can see how this argument works. This is also not the only fear that has been voiced. There are dozens of reports of Uber drivers sexually assaulting women. Companies like Uber have very little ways or systems of reporting bad or dangerous drivers, and thus bad drivers go on, and these things continue to happen at a more rampant rate than if there were safety regulations. So supporters of regulations are coming from a more social welfare ideology model that argues that the state should have a bigger role in the lives of citizens, including regulating companies for safety standards in order to protect citizens. Okay, so the people who are against regulating, so the argument for not regulating is very neoliberal. So kind of letting businesses and capital run free and go where they want. Neoliberalism has crept into our society and treats and runs the state as a business. So in this, we see fewer and fewer regulations in all sectors, and government's role and responsibility in people's lives becomes increasingly smaller and smaller. This is exactly what we see has been done in this case. So as I explained earlier, the City of Toronto was actually against regulating Uber in an effort to support cab companies, stating that removing regulations for cab companies and for Uber drivers would, and I'm saying this in air quotes, would level the playing field. So Uber has stated that they are open to regulations, but that the regulations need to take their business model into consideration as it functions on part-time drivers who they argue would be dissuaded from becoming drivers if they had to pay a huge licensing fee or if it took too long. So Lyft, which is, like I've mentioned Lyft a few times, it's another rideshare program. So the executive director there, Michael Matterson Mann, contacted city councilors the day before the meeting, which was set to determine whether or not rideshare programs would be regulated or not. So he contacted the city councilors to encourage regulations that worked for their business model, stating, and I quote, 80% of Lyft drivers are only doing this 10 to 15 hours a week, which means burdensome requirements would impede the ability of ride sharing and the benefits associated with it to be successful in Toronto, end quote. So instead of regulations, Uber and other apps argue that they self-regulate, which I've already talked about a little bit, through the internal rating system, and that by not regulating the service through policy, it can provide a better service at a lower charge. They also argue that it's a free market, that the market will regulate itself, and that taxi drivers have had a monopoly on the system for years. This is, again, a very neoliberal standpoint, as we know. They argue that rules and price caps have restricted entry of other players and ruined competition over the years and unfairly protected taxi drivers over the years. So apps like Uber and Lyft are offering a more affordable, faster service for customers, and placing regulation and new regulations on Uber would leave the customer with a similar system that clearly isn't working. However, removing regulations and allowing taxi drivers to become competitive with new competition allows them to take advantage and compete. So they also argue that this creates more flexibility for the drivers themselves, whereas old systems and regulations have forced drivers to lease taxis from taxi agents, work scheduled hours, and in some cities in the States put down huge amounts of money to buy into the medallion system, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later. So those are kind of like the main arguments for on the policy responses of the argument for regulating rideshare programs and for not regulating. Okay, so just kind of briefly, in thinking about Whitehead's topology, Nick's family is working from an improving living and working conditions framework. So they argue that it's not the individual driver who is responsible for the death of Nick, but poor working conditions caused by deregulation that led to this, so bad policy. Again, in thinking about policy responses of deregulating and Bocci's article on problematization, we can see how Nick's death is framed differently by supporters of regulation and supporters of deregulation. The problem of Nick's death is thought of to be caused by a bad individual by Uber and the City of Toronto, who support deregulation, that the responsibility of the death of Nick lies within the individual driver. So this is the argument we've heard a billion times of, like, there's a few bad apples, and we hear this all the time. So Uber got rid of this driver and saw this as a solution to the problem, whereas the problem for Nick's family rests in the failure of public policy to support safety regulations, not in the individual driver who caused the accident. Okay, so that's kind of a story about a young man's death and then how that relates to public policy. So now I'm going to kind of explain and give a little bit of my opinion on how I see social work related to this, and how I see social work's responsibility in terms of decolonizing and social justice and human rights from this policy issue. So I think that this issue speaks to kind of a larger issue and question of what government's role is in a neoliberal society. So one of the reasons I picked this particular topic is because I really think it showcases where our values lie as a society within neoliberalism. This is about more than just taxis versus Uber drivers. It's kind of part of a larger structural issue of what do we as a society value. So within neoliberalism, we are seeing more and more push for companies to be deregulated and driven by the market. However, in this case, we can see some of the real-world impacts of that. Responding to this policy issue is really about responding to the issue of what role do we want governments to play in our lives. So I'm going to give a brief example of another group who is invested and concerned about this issue, which are taxi drivers themselves and how this relates to social work. So as I pointed out in Toronto, taxi drivers used to have to comply with higher levels of regulation than they currently do. So in the US, taxi drivers have had a different set of regulations to guide them. So I'm going to give New York as a specific example. So since 1937, New York has required taxi drivers to purchase medallions like many other major cities. A taxi medallion is like a transferable permit in the US that allows a taxi driver to operate. So people can purchase them, or they can sell them, or give them to other people, and it allows you basically to be able to legally drive a cab. So New York traditionally would set limits on the number of medallions that could be sold a year, and set the numbers of medallions artificially low to create a scarcity in the market. This led to the price of medallions at its highest to be worth $1.3 million in 2014. So with ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft coming onto the market, it has led to the value of medallions tanking, leading only about 20 to be sold in August. As of August this year, only about 20 were sold in New York for $150,000. So it's a huge decrease in value. So basically, I think what this means to social workers is we now have a huge amount of people who are largely poor immigrant families who have spent their entire life savings or taken out huge loans to fund purchasing medallions and now can barely make the interest payment. So this has led to an alarming amount of suicides by taxi drivers in the U.S. And feeling hopeless, working longer hours, and unable to make payments as Uber and other ride-sharing apps have saturated the market. So this has actually led New York to introduce policy to regulate for-hire vehicles like Uber that will limit the number of drivers who can drive for Uber and Lyft, and how they have established a minimum rate of pay for these drivers. So I think something else just kind of interesting to note is that there was a huge push for this regulation, and this was from the taxi drivers themselves, especially after this kind of increase in suicide of cab drivers. So there was about 5 in 5 months in New York. Yet a large part of this press coverage and policy was targeted towards protecting Uber drivers, who are largely white, young people who are supplementing their incomes with Uber, whereas taxi drivers are professional drivers who are largely immigrants. So I think it's interesting to think about here who policy is protecting, and how policy is being spun to target specific kinds of people, and again, how the problem is being constructed here. So some of this policy has worked to construct the problem as Uber drivers not being compensated, rather than a traditionally vulnerable low-income profession mostly made up of immigrants being flushed out by part-time white young people, and that being the problem and the only problem. So just something interesting to think about. So we can see social work would come into play in supporting taxi drivers who are out of work, dealing with an increase in financial stress, which is leading drivers to take their own lives, and in supporting the families of taxi drivers who are impacted by their loved ones' hardships. So additionally, unemployment can lead to already vulnerable communities being more at risk of homelessness, which can influence depression, which we know is linked to addiction. So we know how much oppression is interlocked, so it's not difficult to determine how dire this situation is becoming and how social work would be involved. So social workers are also involved in terms of working with immigrants and supporting them, and I'm saying this in quotes, adjusting to Canadian society. So if you look at the Immigration Canada government website, there's actually a link there on how to become a cab driver. So this is something that government advertises and promotes for new immigrants, and it's something social workers are actively involved in supporting our clients to do. However, given the current climate, what would our role be now? Would we encourage immigrants to become cab drivers still, or Uber drivers? So we know, like I've said, a lot of taxi drivers are from other countries. So in New York, as of 2016, 91% of the city's professional drivers were immigrants, many of whom were coming from the world's poorest countries, such as Dominican Republic and Bangladesh. So immigrants rely on cab companies for employment and have invested in the city's licensing standards. Working for Uber is much more precarious, and is by design meant to supplement a primary income. So remember the Lyft executive statement about who is driving for Lyft, rather than working for a cab company, which gave people more employment stability, especially with the way the market was set up to protect cab drivers through the monopolization of the market and keeping the numbers artificially low. So we can see how throwing away regulation here hurts our city's most vulnerable and benefits those in positions of power and privilege. So another way social work would be involved here, or another responsibility they would have, is implicated with Nick's family. So these would be our patients in hospital. So supporting family members and patients who are in ICU is something social workers do. So I worked in ICU a little bit this past summer during my practicum at the Royal Jubilee, and I spent a lot of time working with families of patients who were dying, and supporting the family coming to grips with Nick's death would be part of our job. So, as we can see, kind of under neoliberalism, less and less regulation means less and less safety regulation, and less of a safety net for vulnerable people. So, this will impact social work greatly in hospitals, as less safety regulations mean people are at greater risk of accidents, and people experiencing financial hardship are more likely. Deregulation also means a lot of companies pack up and leave Canada and open shop in poorer countries where regulations are even laxer. So we can see this kind of like as a global trend, not just bound up in Canada. So we see this example in many companies that produce their goods in other countries, like Ford Motor operating in Mexico rather than Ontario, which led to huge job losses in Canada, and many union workers being out of work. So social workers again would be involved here with the unemployed union workers and the workers being exploited in Mexico by Ford Motors. So what I think we as social workers learn over and over and over again from these examples is how social work is implicated in issues of deregulation and lack of policy. So social workers are also not exempt from neoliberalism's cuts to regulations. Social work full-time jobs with benefits and good wages are increasingly more difficult to find, and lots of social workers find themselves working part-time and precariously trying to make ends meet. So we as social workers have a responsibility to fight for social justice when low-wage earning immigrants are taking their lives and families are losing children. So this becomes a social work responsibility, and we as social workers are not exempt from the effects of neoliberalism. So I realize I'm going a little long here, so I'm just going to kind of quickly say that the issue of regulation in rideshare programs is currently being debated in Toronto, and Nick's family have started an online petition to fight for Uber and other rideshare apps and taxi drivers to be regulated and have those safety standards put back in place. So I've just included a link here if you feel so obliged to sign. These are my discussion questions, so I'm not going to read them. I'll let you read them. I'm just going to end my presentation there, and I look forward to our discussion this week. Thanks.